Hello and welcome to our last discussion on Kant's moral theory. If you recall, the structure of our theory thus far tells us that we have the categorical imperative as our theory of the right. And again, we've seen two different versions of the categorical imperative. We'll recap those here in a moment. We also see that Kant has described dignity or rational nature as being his conception of the good. Non-moral value, that is, our item of intrinsic worth, or intrinsic good, is autonomy, again, our ability to make free choices. And moral value, which will be the primary topic of this lecture, is important for Kant. He describes that we are worthy of praise or blame for our actions, depending on whether or not we're acting from the sole motive of duty. Again, let's look at our theory in a nutshell. Remember that we have two different formulations of the categorical imperative. An action is right if and only if failing to perform it would fail to respect humanity, and act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. For further details on these, please look at the first two Kant lectures. Our theory in a nutshell about the good, remember that autonomy, that is our freedom of choice, which is based on our rational nature, again, which is dignity, is an end in itself, thus it has unconditional intrinsic worth. Now for Kant, moral value is related to a person depending on their traits, that is based on their goodness or their badness, what we call their virtues or their vices. Moral value, if you recall, is the type of value we apply to agents, whereas non-moral value is applied to things. And when we talk about agents, we talk about whether or not they can be praised or blamed for their actions. Now, other theories that we'll discuss in this semester have radically different ideas with regards to what makes an agent praiseworthy or blameworthy. According to Kant, there's only one moral virtue, and that's the moral strength of a human being's will in fulfilling his duty. According to Kant, being a morally good person involves being disposed to act from the sole motive of duty when duty calls. That is, we have to resist temptations to transgress the requirements of duty. Timmons writes, "The shopkeeper who gives correct change to young and inexperienced customers because he is interested in guarding his good business reputation fulfills a moral obligation, and so does his duty. But since his motive is one of self-interest, his dutiful action does not possess moral worth. Only when the act of giving correct change is motivated solely by the thought that the action is a duty does the shopkeeper's action possess moral worth." Another example. Let's imagine, for example, a situation in which a person comes across a drowning child. Now again, we've discussed the drowning child issue as well in the past. So our drowning child is in such a predicament that we are the only person who can save them. So let's think about reasons why we might. Well, if we look at this child who's drowning and we say, well, I should run out to save this child because this child is a valuable person in and of him or herself, and I have a duty to respect their autonomy, which may involve perhaps a duty to promote their happiness, which may involve me saving their life. And if I'm acting solely from that, then according to Kant, the person will be morally praised. Let's imagine another situation. Let's imagine instead of that being my thought process, that instead I think, well, if I save this child, I may receive all sorts of accolades, the key to the city, maybe in the news, perhaps this will help improve my reputation, things along those lines. Well, if I'm acting from that motive, which again, for example, would be a motive of self-interest, then I'm not acting morally, according to Kant. I may be doing my duty, I may be doing the right thing, but I may not be doing it for the right reasons. And because I'm not doing it for the right reasons, I therefore cannot be praised for my action, even if the end result is the same, that is, with a saved child. Now, Kant also describes the highest good. Kant believes that the highest good for human beings also leads him to believe certain things about immortality and God. Kant believes that the highest good for humans has two major components. That is, the possession of a virtuous character, so again, a person who's acting from the sole motive of duty, and we end up becoming happy because it's a reward for virtue. Kant says, for this is the highest good, happiness is also required. For to need happiness, to be also worthy of it, and yet not to participate in it, cannot be consistent with the perfect volition of a rational being that would at the same time have all power, even if we think of such a being only for the sake of experiment. Kant believes that human beings are essentially creatures with needs and desires, whose satisfaction constitutes our happiness. So in order for us to possess the highest good for us, ultimately we have to have these two things. Happiness, again, is something we can't seek. Happiness comes from doing the right thing. Now, Kant believes that in order for us to achieve this, there are two things that come from this. Two, what he calls practical postulates. Basically, the immortality of the soul and the existence of God. Timmins quotes Kant in the following way. This endless progress is, however, possible only in the presupposition of the existence and personality of the same rational being continuing endlessly, which is called immortality of the soul. Hence, the highest good is practically possible only in the presupposition of the immortality of the soul, so that this, and inseparably connected with the moral law, is a postulate of pure practical reason. That is, Kant believes that ultimately he can say that we have an immortal soul simply through thinking about it. Furthermore, this postulate takes care of the possibility of the first element of the highest good. But as already noted, there is no necessary connection, at least in this life, between being virtuous and being happy. And this point leads Kant to state, the supposition of the existence of a cause adequate to this effect, happiness as a reward for virtue, that is, it must also postulate the existence of God as belonging necessarily to the possibility of the highest good. So therefore, the highest good is only achievable if we assume that we are mortal and that there is a God. Now, this is pretty controversial. Kant basically is arguing here that our knowledge of the world is limited to what we can what we can know through our senses and through thought. Now, Kant's saying in particular here that we cannot have knowledge of things such as freedom, immortality of the soul, and God. We can consistently conceive of these things, but nevertheless we can't have knowledge of them. Timmins writes, in his moral writings, Kant still insists that humans cannot have knowledge of freedom, immortality, and God. However, freedom, autonomy, is a presupposition for the possibility of morality, and immortality and God must be postulated in order to allow for the possibility of the highest good. So Kant, in that sense, kind of creates a back door to bring in God, to bring in his maybe perhaps religious or metaphysical beliefs. Nietzsche, a philosopher we'll study later, called Kant an underhanded Christian for having done so. Now, there are several objections that we can make towards Kant's theory. First, we can focus on Kant's conception of duty. First, we need to ask, is it really intrinsically irrational to fail to adopt the ends of self-perfection and the happiness of others? There may not be necessarily an irrational component to not do so. We may be able to here look to David Hume, again, a philosopher who we'll look at later in the semester briefly, and who Kant credited for awakening him from his, quote, dogmatic slumber. Hume asks whether or not reason can ever operate independently of our desires. According to Hume, these two things are very intimately and intricately connected. If that's the case, hypothetical imperatives may be the only way to make sense of duty. And if that's the only way to make sense of duty, if the categorical imperative doesn't make sense because rationality doesn't work the way how Kant believes it works, then may be able to argue, therefore, that Kant's conception of duty itself is flawed. And if that's flawed, his theory may not stand up well. We can also have to ask whether or not human flourishing could possibly be a ground for morality as opposed to rationality. It opens the door for a different conception of morality than Kant gives us. We can also challenge Kant on his conception of virtue. It seems that a virtuous agent is in a state of moral conflict and chooses the right action for the reasons we've noted, that is, for acting through the sole motive of duty. But we also have to ask, is a person who acts in a virtuous way but not from the motive of duty still virtuous? Imagine, for example, that I'm doing some type of action out of a motive of love. Well, according to Kant, that doesn't fly. I can't be praised for that. But when we consider our traditional and kind of everyday moral beliefs, we like to believe that people can act morally for many different reasons. If a person is acting out of compassion, for example, can we say that that's a morally worthy action as well? According to Kant, we can't. And that leads us to an uncomfortable place as well. Last, we may be able to even challenge the categorical imperative itself. The HEI formulation of the categorical imperative is remarkably vague. It doesn't really tell me how to respect humanity. Additionally, Kant never really gives me a reason or a way to think about how we should deal with conflicting duties. Again, what happens when I have two maxims, both of which, for the sake of argument, may be relevant, but both of which apply to the situation? How do I choose? How do I choose with duties that conflict? Say, for example, duties perhaps to family versus nation. Kant doesn't really give us a good reason or a good way to look through this. So in the end, when we examine Kant's theory, we have problems associated with the relevant maxims. And when we have problems with relevant maxims, we have problems with consistency. Likewise, the vagueness associated with the humanity as an end in itself formulation of the categorical imperative, with that conception of respect, fails to give us determinacy. Kant's trying to go for something very, very specific with his theory, and he's not quite getting there. Now, we like the idea that we should respect people. That seems appealing to us. Also, we like to think that ways in which we relate to one another maybe explain what makes an action right or wrong, and it's pretty useful for it to appeal to a sense of rationality. So therefore, we could say that it falls and meets, that is, the other criteria.